In my trade, there is a rule. If an extra part remains after assembly, the mechanism is faulty. For 93 years, I threw extra emotions and raspy notes out of my son's life until I realized I had thrown away his soul. Now my clock runs perfectly, but I have no one to count the time for. My vision has long since become selective. I do not see the faces of neighbors, I do not see the dirt on the windowsill, but I clearly distinguish microscopic notches on the anchor wheel. In my 93 years, the world has narrowed to the radius of a desk lamp in my workshop on the outskirts of Zurich. Here, among thousands of clocks ticking out of sync, I feel like a conductor of chaos that has long since turned into a symphony of solitude. They say a profession leaves an imprint on the soul. My soul is a complex mechanism where gears work instead of emotions, and instead of love, a strict calculation of amplitude. I look at the kettle boiling on the stove and see not a kitchen appliance, but an object disrupting the isochronism of my morning. Its whistle is a false note in the perfect mechanism of my existence. All my life I have looked for errors, that which prevents the system from working eternally and flawlessly. I corrected the course of time, straightened bent axes, lubricated dry ruby stones. I learned to stop the decay in metal, but proved powerless against the decay in the mirror. My hands, they are the only thing that still connects me to reality. Thin, wrinkled fingers like the roots of an old oak tree grown through steel. They do not tremble. This is professional pride, the last barricade of my narcissism. I remember how clients from Bahnhofstrasse brought me their family heirlooms, whispering, "Only Markus Eberhardt can restore their heartbeat." And I did. I was the god of small universes encased in gold cases. I fixed other people's lives by simply tightening one screw. But now, in this silence, I am surrounded by objects that despise me. An old rocking chair creaks at a frequency that causes me physical pain. It runs fast by 2 seconds for every cycle. The silver spoon with which I stir my sugar has a barely noticeable dent that reminds me of my own imperfection. Every item in this house is a witness to my triumph and my defeat. I created a world where everything must work correctly, but in this world there is no place for a human, only for a mechanism. Loneliness at 93 is not the absence of people. It is the presence of things that no longer make sense. My son, Thomas. His photograph stands on the shelf, blocked by boxes of spare parts. I haven't looked at it for years because in his face I see not a continuation of my lineage, but a project I tried to polish to a mirror shine. His eyes in the photo look somewhere past me, into that space where there are no watchmakers. I remember the smell of coffee mixing with the smell of Mobius oil. This aroma is my personal drug. It gives the illusion of control. When I disassemble a mechanism, I feel chaos becoming order. But as soon as I lift my head from the microscope, I see an empty room. The walls absorb the sounds of my footsteps. I became a hostage of my own mastery. I am a master who learned how to fix time, but lost a life. Time is not a river. It is a vast canvas with toothed gears. If one tooth is broken, everything stops. All my life I looked for this broken tooth in others. I fixed them without asking permission. I was the shadow of greatness that eclipsed any sunlight trying to break through the windows of my house. My success was so bright that Thomas always squinted while standing next to me. He was merely a backdrop to my brilliant performance. Now I sit by the window. Outside the window are the Alps. cold and indifferent as my heart. I take the tweezers. Parts are scattered on the table's small brass hearts. I try to gather memories together, but they slip away like tiny M0.5 screws. I feel that somewhere deep within my own mechanism, a breakdown has occurred. Something snapped many years ago when I decided I had the right to repair my son's voice. Today, for the first time in a long time, I do not want to work. I look at my tools. They lie in even rows, shining with cold steel. They are my only friends and my executioners. I feel guilt, but it is not sharp. It is like chronic rheumatism, aching somewhere under my ribs, reminding me that the sun is already setting and I never learned to just breathe without counting the seconds. I close my eyes, and I see Thomas on stage, his first performance, his voice. Back then it seemed to me that it sounded wrong, not according to standard, and I, the great Markus Eberhardt, decided that I had to fix it. I had to tune him like an old chronometer. I open my eyes. A silver spring still lies on the floor. I do not pick it up. Let it lie. This is the first part in my life that I do not want to put back in its place. The creak of the floorboards under my steps in 1965 sounded different. It was resilient, full of the strength of a man who believed he held fate itself by the throat. Thomas was 12. Back then we lived in a suburb of Boston, in a house where every room was sterile as an operating room. I was already that same Eberhardt, whose name was spoken with bated breath in the workshops of New York and London. My greatness was not in money, but in an absolute, almost religious striving for perfection. I did not tolerate errors, neither in pendulums nor in people. Thomas sang in the church choir. He had a wonderful tenor soft, velvety, with that innate raspiness that teachers called soul. But for me, it wasn't soul. For me, it was a malfunction. In my understanding, the perfect sound had to be clear as polished glass, mathematically precise, without unnecessary overtones that disrupted the purity of the line. When he practiced at home, I locked myself in the workshop, but that sound broke through the walls. It distorted. It was too human, too chaotic. That evening, which I still see in the smallest detail, down to the dust motes dancing in the lamplight, Thomas was preparing for his first solo performance in the chapel. He stood in the middle of the living room holding sheet music, and his face glowed with that special happiness found only in children who have found their path. I, however, stood in the doorway holding a set of precision screwdrivers I had just been cleaning. "You're going flat again on the transition to A, son," I said instead of a greeting. He startled. The music in him fell silent, as if someone had cut a string. "But the teacher says it adds emotion, Dad." "The teacher is an amateur." I cut him off, stepping closer. His shadow on the wall was so small compared to mine. "Emotion is an excuse for a lack of technique. You've seen how I work. If a gear tooth deviates even by a micron from the calculation, the mechanism will perish. Your voice is an instrument. And right now, it is out of tune." I began my repair. It wasn't physical abuse, no. It was a subtle, jewelry-like destruction. Over the following months, I became his shadow, his personal metronome. I forced him to repeat the same phrase thousands of times, achieving sterile purity. I bought him the most expensive recording equipment. I hired the best teachers, but I gave them clear instructions. Remove the dirt. Remove the living vibration. Make his vocals as predictable as the movement of my clocks. I remember his eyes. They became increasingly transparent, as if he were gradually disappearing, dissolving into my demands. He tried to please me. He wanted me to look at him the same way I looked at a rare Patek Philippe mechanism, with admiration and certainty that everything was working correctly. The fatal scene occurred a week before the big concert. I entered his room without knocking. He was singing something of his own, not from the program, something wild, uneven, beautiful. Seeing me, he faltered. On the table next to him lay my tools. I had left them there earlier, so he would get used to order. In a fit of nervous trembling, he brushed against the box with his hand. The tools scattered. Dozens of steel probes, tweezers, and punches hit the parquet with the sound of a shattering mirror. That sound frightened him more than my anger. He rushed to collect them, crying, while I stood over him and coldly commented, "Even your movements have no rhythm, Thomas. How do you plan to conquer the stage if you cannot hold order in your hands?" I took him by the chin, forcing him to lift his head. His cheeks were wet. "We will replace your breathing technique. We will take away this rasp. You will become perfect. You will become my greatest creation." In that moment, I did not see a sun. I saw an object that needed calibration. I repaired his vocals, killing the desire to sing in him. I inserted an iron core into his chest instead of a living heart. I did not know then that a perfectly tuned clock, in which there is not a single error, is a clock that no one is interested in listening to. I was blinded by my own greatness. I thought I was creating a masterpiece, but in reality, I was just building a golden cage for him out of second hands. My shadow covered him completely, and instead of growing toward the sun, he began to wither in my clinical coldness. I cleaned his voice of errors, not realizing that it was these very errors that made him my son. Decades passed, and my repair work began to bear fruit that I then considered sweet. Thomas became what I had carved out of him, a perfect mechanism. My son's life turned into a flawlessly calibrated chronometer. In the 70s and 80s, he became a star of academic singing in Europe. He was called the crystal tenor. Critics wrote about his inhuman purity and the mathematical precision of every note. I read these reviews in my workshop, sipping cognac, and felt a warm, poisonous satisfaction spreading inside me. This was my triumph. I had built this path. I was the master who had straightened every curve of his fate. He lived in Vienna, then in Salzburg. I often traveled to his performances. I sat in the front row, steadfast and cold as a monument to my own ego. When he walked onto the stage, he did not look at the hall. He looked at me. His singing was not an appeal to God or humanity. It was a report to the chief engineer. He performed Mozart's parts as if every sound passed through a filtration system I had installed in his throat that evening in Boston. But in this greatness, there was one strange nuance that I noticed but ignored. Thomas never smiled after concerts. He gathered bouquets, bowed, but his face remained a mask of white porcelain. He became the perfect object, a backdrop for my pride. He never married, had no friends who were not part of his professional circle. He was surrounded by people, but lived in the vacuum I had created around him so that nothing could shake his progress. I remember one evening in Munich after his performance in Don Giovanni. We were dining in an expensive restaurant. The crystal on the tables rang in the same key as his voice. "Dad," he said suddenly, looking at his plate, "have you ever heard a broken spring cry in a watch?" I frowned. Springs don't cry, Thomas. They either work or they break. If one breaks, it is replaced. Yes, he replied softly. Replaced? I did not understand the depth of that despair then. I saw only the brilliance of his career. I believed that he was me, only in a different state of matter. I used his success as fuel for my confidence. Every award of his was my part, every positive article my tool. I was the sun, and he was merely a planet reflecting my light. Without me, he would not shine, or so I told myself. And then the fading began. It wasn't a catastrophe, no. It was a quiet, professional wearing down of the gear teeth. His voice began to lose that very sterility I had so cherished. Not because he was aging, he was still in his prime, but because the mechanism simply grew tired of working without the lubrication of living joy. He began to sing even more correctly, even more dryly, until the audience began to feel the cold of a tombstone in his performance. Theaters began to offer him smaller roles, then only teaching. He did not resist. He simply fell silent. Slowly, year after year, my perfect mirage dissolved. He returned to Switzerland, settled in a small house a 2-hour drive from my workshop. We saw each other rarely. Every meeting of ours was a parade of formalities. We discussed the weather, prices for antiques, the state of my health. But we never spoke about music, and we never spoke about that evening with the scattered tools. I saw him fading. His movements became slow, mechanical. He became like a watch that had been forgotten to be wound, and its pendulum swings by inertia, less and less each time. I saw this and did nothing. I couldn't fix depression because it had no physical manifestation that could be picked up with tweezers. I felt irritation. My best project was failing, and I had no spare part to replace it. He died quietly, in his sleep, 5 years ago. Heart failure, the doctor said. I, however, knew it was metal fatigue. The mechanism simply exhausted its resource of patience. At the funeral, I did not cry. I stood by the coffin and thought about how the angle of the lid was not perfectly parallel to the ground. My professional deformation became my armor against grief. I returned to my workshop, to my thousands of clocks, and only then, in this absolute silence, I began to hear what he had asked about, the cry of a broken spring. This sound began to haunt me in every tick. I created a world where everything was correct, but in this world, there was no life. I won the battle for precision, but I lost the war for my son. Now I sit surrounded by his few things that were handed over to me after his death. A large box that I didn't dare to open until this morning. This morning, I finally opened that box. It smelled of old paper and dust, the smell of things that had waited too long for their verdict. Among old programs and yellowed reviews, I found a small leather case. My fingers, accustomed to the touch of cold metal, trembled. Inside lay my old voice recordera bulky model from the 70s that I had once given Thomas so he could record his practices and perform work on his errors. On the cassette inside, in his handwriting, only one word was written: to Father. I pressed the play button. First, there was a long, heavy silence filled only with the background hiss of the magnetic tape, and then I heard his voice. But it wasn't the crystal tenor the world knew. It was the voice of an adult man, trembling with suppressed tears. Dad, I tried to be your perfect clock. I cleaned every note. I killed every false vibration in myself that you hated so much. But do you know what the joke is? When I became flawless, I stopped feeling alive. You weren't fixing me, Dad. You were remaking me into spare parts for your greatness. Every time I went on stage, I saw your tweezers ready to rip out my heart if it beat out of rhythm with your expectations. You won. I am a perfect mechanism, but clocks do not know how to love, and they do not know how to forgive. Then a sound played on the recording that made my chest go cold. It was singing. Thomas began to sing an old lullaby that his mother used to sing to him. He sang it intentionally, unevenly, with those same errors, with that same dirt and rasp that I had burned out of him with iron. It was the most beautiful and most terrifying performance I have ever heard. It was the cry of a living creature locked in a steel machine. At the end of the recording, a loud crash was heard. It was the sound of scattered tools. He had intentionally recreated that scene from childhood. And in that silence that followed the metallic ring, I understood everything. My guilt is not just an error in calculations. It is a crime against life itself. I spent 93 years trying to stop entropy, not realizing that beauty lies precisely in imperfection. I feared chaos, feared emotions that cannot be measured with a caliper. I thought I was making him great, but I was just making him convenient for my narcissism. I was like that master who wanted the clock to run forever so badly that he welded all the gears into one monolith. The clock no longer made errors, but it didn't run either. Now, I look at you, reader. You who hold tools of influence over someone's life, be it parenthood, love, or power. Look at those you are repairing. Are you not trying to turn them into mirrors of your own pride? Does your shadow of greatness not prevent them from simply breathing with their own uneven and wrong rhythm? I sit in this cold workshop, surrounded by gold and crystal, but I am the poorest person in the world. I have thousands of clocks, but I don't have a single second I could turn back just to hug the boy on the floor among the scattered tools and say, "Sing out of tune, son. The main thing is sing yourself." The spring on the floor still lies there. It looks like an infinity symbol of my infinite, refined, and absolutely precise solitude. Do not make my mistake. Do not try to tune the world to your metronome. Allow time to be imperfect. For only in that gap between the correct and the real does that which we call the soul live. My time is running out. My own mechanism is making its last dry crunch. And for the first time in my life, I am glad that this progress cannot be fixed.